So here we are.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Sitting in beautiful Annweiler, and
Yes.
I'm not alone here, and I'm talking in English with a nice little quad driving beside us. Next to me, or vice versa, is sitting Professor Maggie Lee Huckabee.
Maggie Lee.
Maggie Lee, welcome to Isnix.
Well, thank you. It's very
And-
good to be here.
And in front of us there is nice ice cream, because our initial idea of Isnix was to have nice food or drinks or anything to swallow when we're talking about swallowing. And I'm very happy that you are keen to talk with me about swallowing this today while we are having ice cream. Do you like your ice cream?
I love my ice cream. Which that wasn't very clear because I just put ice cream in my mouth the second you asked.
We met a few days ago in Marburg at the first summer school there, and you were talking about skill training. And I thought it might be a good idea to share some of these thoughts with our listeners when they can hear us, because there are many cars driving by. But it will be the special challenge.
That's
Not
right.
just to listen to us while we are talking in English, but also to
Over the sound of cars.
Yes.
Traffic noise in the background.
So, your research interest for the last couple of years is the skill training. How would you define, or how would you explain to someone what skill training or what skill is, maybe?
I think that skill training is a bit of an expansion of our concept for rehabilitation. That historically we have always focused on muscle strengthening because the basic belief was that you couldn't change the reflexive swallow. Swallowing is a reflex. You can't change a reflex, so all you can do is change the muscle that controls the reflex. And I think we know that that's not true. And so the idea behind skill training is that we essentially take rehab out of the muscle and we put it in the brain. So we work with an individual on whatever specific component of their swallowing is poorly skilled, give them some type of way to visualize that behavior through a biofeedback modality, and then they use cortical control to adjust the swallowing motor program so that they swallow more efficiently, in short.
In short. So,
In long.
in long it would probably take us forever, because it's such a really interesting topic to talk about. What was the initial thought that led you to the thinking that it's not all about strengthening? Because we're doing dysphagia therapy for many decades now, and it's a new approach, actually.
I think a lot of it's sort of two things in parallel. The one is that a lot of our assumptions about swallowing motor control came from research back in the late 70s, early to mid 80s. It was largely based on animal studies, so electrically stimulating the brains of animals, and then looking at the patterned motor response. But of course, we're not animals. And although our primitive swallow may operate with the central pattern generator, I think we've got a very clear view over more recent years that the cortex has a very, very active role in controlling swallowing. And so we need to start looking to the cortex and looking at swallowing not as a pure reflex, but as a patterned motor response that's amenable to cortical change. So there's that line that we've sort of been shifting our concepts of swallowing. But sort of simultaneously in my clinical work, I've come across patients where I thought I was making them stronger. That was my goal, because that's all I knew how to do, was make them stronger. And they got better. But when I look back on them, I think I couldn't have only been strengthening muscle, or they wouldn't be better, as in the case of patients with absent swallow who recover swallowing function. And you think, if all you were doing is making muscle stronger, how do they go from not swallowing to swallowing? That just doesn't make sense. So one patient in particular, it's another quad bike in the lovely village of Enweiler. Indeed, it's quite the day for quad
You would
bikes.
expect what's driving by
Exactly.
in such a little village here.
So anyway, a number of years ago, in 1994, I had a patient just like this who recovered swallowing, and I think she was my first one that I thought, hang on, something's not right here. I think I'm making them stronger, but clearly that's not the effect. It's just taken me a whole lot of years in between to figure out how we could systematically approach this, and for my thinking to develop enough to think that this maybe should be an approach to treatment.
What would you think? What role plays the aspect of feedback in this whole skill training approach? Because we are doing SMG biofeedback training for quite a long time, but always with the maybe not always with this pure strengthening aspect, but it was always the used for learning Mendelssohn's or even effortful swallows, or maybe in sometimes for timing issues, but in a very unstructured way.
Sure.
What would you say? What aspect has feedback in this whole process of cortical control? Or
I think the feedback is absolutely integral to skill training. That when there have been a couple of review manuscripts that have come out, systematic reviews over the last couple of years, and their question has always been, is surface EMG an effective treatment approach?
but it's not a treatment approach.
It's not a treatment approach. That's always been my response, is that it's when you use EMG as a treatment for strengthening is the active treatment. EMG is just a way to access that. Now, when you get into skill-based training, I think that distinction is a bit harder, because in skill training, if we look at principles of motor learning and principles of neural change, that a fundamental tenet of neural adaptation is that the individual has to perform a functional task, receive knowledge of results or feedback of how, such that they can modulate the behavior to perform it differently the next time. And you're not going to get neural change by just repeating a task over and over and over again. And so it's really fundamental to skill training that you have a feedback modality of some description, whether it's EMG, whether it's manometry, whether it's swallowing, respiratory coordination, whether it's acoustic, whether who knows what it is. But that feedback component is really critical, because how do you change swallowing if you can't see swallowing? It's not like an arm or a leg where you have direct visualization. So I think that the feedback modality is probably a fundamental core component of skill training, much more so than when we used biofeedback in strength training.
So, do you think it makes a difference? So, just to explain, the skill training that you developed in your lab, and you, which is an opportunity to really use the skill training approach in swallowing, is that people are linked to the with surface electrode, surface EMG device, which is connected to a computer, and they see a screen. Pretty much that there is a line coming up whenever they activate their muscles, their submental muscles. And hopefully they are swallowing to activate their muscles.
Yes.
And they see a little box on the screen, and the goal is to reach the box with the peak of the
waveform.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. And they are learning to modulate the swallow in terms of timing and in terms of recruitment of muscles to change it, because the box always appears on different spots on the screen.
That's right. And I think the sort of, I'm glad you explained all of that so that I can eat my ice cream because it's melting quickly. So, but I think that when you think about how we typically eat, so you have in front of you, there's cream, which is very soft. You have a crispy little wafer, which is crunchy.
And I have liquid.
You have liquid. You've also got sticky chocolate sauce, and you've got a piece of candy that's quite viscous. And if you think about how we eat when we sit down at a meal, we've got all these textures in front of us. And so for every bite that you take a different texture.
Yes.
Every texture that you swallow is going to require slightly different timing. And it's also, in terms of timing of onset hyolaryngeal movement, it's also going to require different degrees of muscle recruitment. Never effortful swallowing, because that's not how we eat. We don't do an effortful swallow when we eat. But if you're going to swallow a teaspoon of peanut butter or chocolate sauce, you're going to need to generate a little bit more muscle recruitment than you would, say, for liquid, right? As an ambulance drives by. So,
without his horn on.
Thank goodness, without his ambulance, without his sirens on. And so I think in some respects, the skill training protocol that we've been using in some respects mimics what happens when you eat. It's just you don't have the bolus providing the sensory information to the brainstem. You have the cortex providing the cortical downflow to modulate the swallowing response. So on one screen, you may need to swallow very quickly at the start of the screen because the target is at the top or at the beginning of the screen. The next screen, you may need to swallow toward the end of the screen, so you don't have to organize yourself as quickly. Or you may have the target reasonably high on the screen, so you need to recruit a little more muscle activity. Or it may be down toward the bottom of the screen, and I think it's that variation and almost randomness in how we typically swallow food. It's not random, but it's very variable for bolus that we're trying to mimic in the software, so that we're teaching you to recruit the muscles with precision. And I think that's the difference between strength and skill. With strength training, we're recruiting muscles with maximal force. With skill training, we're recruiting muscles with precision of contraction.
So, would you say that, like, the brainstem is the system that triggers the normal standard saliva swallow, and whenever it comes to any kind of variation that is required to swallow a certain type of bolus, it's the sensory feedback that triggers the variation and adaptation of the swallow, and the biscuit tries to some sort of simulate these variations, that the system gets more flexible and not just like do 20 effortful swallows, which is always the same.
That's right.
Motor program that is.
That's right.
Okay, that's really interesting.
That it's essentially trying to teach cortical control of motor behavior, and we always think of swallowing as being very out of reach. It's like, how do you swallow? Well, I don't know how I swallow. And if you ask an 84-year-old patient to modulate how they swallow, it's like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I can't even see swallowing. I don't know what it is. And so this skill training approach is trying to teach the capacity to cortically adapt swallowing behavior.
And actually, it's really not that easy. I tried it a few times now, and it's really hard, especially when it comes that the box changes its size, because it's not just that it changes its positions on the screen, but
right.
after 3 successful swallows, it becomes smaller and smaller, that
That's
it's
correct.
even more harder to hit the box. And it's really not that easy, but it's really interesting how quick can I say, the brain adapts to it, and
It is.
able to be modulated.
And you know, I think when healthy people first do the skill protocol, they think, oh, this is really hard. Because even for people without neurological impairment, it's hard to think about controlling that behavior. It's a learned task. But I think what's also interesting is that in our patient population, I'm always quite surprised at how much control they learn. And I've got a great video that I use in teaching of a patient, and he's a gentleman with Parkinson's disease. And within a single session, he gets his target box down to a very, very small box. That he's able to acquire that skill very, very well of learning to modulate the force of swallowing and the timing of the swallowing. It's all about modulation. And he's able to learn to do that very, very well.
Now we saw almost all sorts of vehicles you can
Every type
be
of vehicle.
annoyed by in Germany.
There you go.
We already had an airplane.
So much for the peaceful little village.
And besides that, I really think it could be really motivational for the patients, because they see the success, and they really get the feedback, and it's really kind of a fun thing that you help, for example, the old lady to get her cup of tea, because you can adjust the symbols that are used for the training, which might be really nice. If you like dogs, you can choose a dog and bring him his bone.
We did try with developing the software. It was developed for research purposes. And in developing the software, my experience with patients is, you know, if you're a 13-year-old playing a video game, you want lots of bells and whistles and fast-moving things and complicated images to maintain your attention. But if you're a patient with neurological impairment, my experience has been that the simpler the better. And for those especially with some cognitive language deficits, having too much going on the screen, you lose the intent of what you're doing. So we purposely kept it quite simple with only very few modifications to make it a little bit more interesting. But it's pretty simple software.
It is simple, and it's really self-explaining, at least for the patient. I mean, you have a waveform, and you have a target, and it's pretty intuitive.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
It might be different in other approaches. But I really like the idea, if you think on learning new skills, and it always takes the time that you get the external feedback maybe from a trainer or a coach or whoever who is an expert in this field.
Sure.
And who really gives you the feedback and gives you advice how to improve the movement actually, or the whatever you are learning, or the skill, if it's playing the piano or whatever. So how is it that you change this? We have really good. We found a really great spot. I mean, the ice cream is good though.
Yes, it is good ice cream.
But at the next step, it would be really important for the patients that they change this external feedback into an internal feedback, that they really are used to modulate it without this external stimulus. And Biscuit already covers this part as well.
Right.
Could you tell us something about
Yeah, so
this?
one of the options, which with some patients you won't use very often, but in patients who are doing very well with the skill training approach, there is an option to either delay feedback, meaning that when the display screen first comes on, they see the waveform, but then the waveform disappears. The target's still there, but the waveform's gone. They still need to swallow such that the peak of the waveform goes in the target. They just can't see the waveform. After they pass the target, then they get feedback about how they've done. So what that's requiring them to do is to rely on their intrinsic cues and how well they've calibrated themselves to when and to what degree their muscles contracted. There's also a fading schedule where one screen they get feedback, the next screen they don't get anything, full stop. And then the next screen they get feedback. So those are just ways to encourage people to rely more heavily. And, a main principle of using biofeedback, you never want anybody dependent on equipment. So the general idea behind the use of biofeedback is that you're essentially using the instrumentation to recalibrate the patient's system so that they have greater awareness of what is happening physiologically. Then, once you've recalibrated their system, then you take away the external cues so that they rely on their own interoceptive feedback systems. And then that carries over to oral intake, and they don't need equipment. Many of our patients, once they return and are doing quite well with swallowing, we'll ask them if they still use the feedback. And they say, no, I don't need the feedback because I can see it on my eyelids. I think about the box, or I know what I need to do. So that tells us that they've taken that visual feedback and they've internalized it so that they're still using the feedback. They're just not using it the way they were when they could see it in front of them. Now it's inside them.
So do you have the experience from your patients that worked a lot with Biscuit or the skill training approach, that they getting more self-confident in trying
Definitely.
other foods
Yep.
or
Yep.
liquids, or rely
Absolutely.
on themselves because
Absolutely.
they know they can change or adapt to the different.
And again, it's about control and precision. And I think anything that any of us do, the more you feel in control of the behavior, or the more you can modulate that behavior, then the more experimental you get. If someone were learning to ride a scooter for the first time, which I'm not going to do, but let's say you have an electric scooter and you're going to hop on and take off zipping across the car park. At first, you'll be very cautious. You'll go very slowly because you don't trust your intrinsic cues to keep you upright without falling over. You don't trust.
Or you already experienced that you
That's
fell.
right. That's
over.
right.
Yeah.
But as you build more
Sorry for
fighter jets overhead, but as you develop more confidence in your ability, then you go faster and you weave back and forth, and then you develop even more confidence, and then you can do a little jump over something. And I think that the equivalent of that is you start out not really comfortable eating or drinking anything, and then you increase diet texture and continually challenge yourself once you've developed that intrinsic confidence.
And I think one problem is that maybe some clinicians don't give this confidence to the patients because they are more on a secure side and don't want to challenge the patients too much because they want to stay them safe and don't let them try. And this really could be the difficulty to...
It could be, and I guess my response to that is that I think clinicians need to be more confident. That's one response, that we have to know that you can't take a dysphagic patient who's aspirating a lot and get him all the way to recovery in a normal diet without making him aspirate. It will happen. It's inevitable. And so you need to get that idea out of your head. You will make somebody aspirate, probably multiple times, for them to get better. The other response to that is, thank goodness patients develop confidence and don't listen to us, because in some respects, patients need to drive themselves. They're the only ones that know how things are feeling.
This is such an important
and
point.
we need to respect their awareness of that and support them and make them aware of risk. But thank goodness, sometimes they just say, stuff you, I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not a bad thing at all. So
of course.
I think that we need to make sure that we don't stand in the way of patients getting better, because we're afraid that it's not about us, it's about them. And we need to put us out of the picture, give them information, they make their own decisions, I think. So
perfect. I think this is a wonderful word to close our conversation.
Very good. I have finished my ice cream, but you have not finished yours.
Not yet.
So,
I will now.
There you go.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
And we are looking forward to the next time when you will be in Germany.
I'm also looking forward.
Which won't take too long, actually. I mean, you will be
too
back.
far away.
It's not too far away. I mean, you will be
Just
back
a few months in Munich.
In Munich in September.
In September.
Yeah, I already announced that on the podcast. It will be the 17th or 16th and 17th, Monday, Tuesday of September, before the ESSD meeting in Vienna. So you will talk about some of the old stuff and some of the new stuff, which covers a bit of the topic we talked about, but it's 2 days of Maggie Lee Huckabee in Munich.
I'm sorry.
So, and then you will be back in Switzerland in November.
Yes, I will.
And then you will be back in June next year in Heidelberg.
I will.
And whenever in between, we will see.
I think I should just move here. It'd be much more efficient.
But
Good.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Have
Thank
a nice rest of your trip and stay in Germany. And looking forward to see you the next time.
Very good. Thank you.
So we have always the same, I would say, closing ceremony on, and actually it's English, so it should be really easy for you. So you're going to say, no, I'm going to say stay hungry, and you're going to say stay tuned. Okay? So, bis zum nächsten Mal. Stay hungry.
Stay tuned.